are no longer doing business with Cuba, that are hurting the Cuban economy at the worst time of their Great Depression. So all this combines to create this siege. No matter what the Cubans are trading with anyone else, you're not allowed to trade with the greatest power on earth. So how do the Cubans respond to that? How does any society respond to siege? How does the United States of America respond when they're at war or under national security threats? Well, the latest example we have is 9/11. The greatest power on earth, the most open democracy the world has ever known, completely collapsed upon itself after this horrible terrorist act. Society closed. Dissent was being not only discouraged, but actively attacked. You remember the walk-up to the war of Iraq? There was one congressman who voted against it, and she was ostracized for years, and still is. You don't have dissent when you feel you're under attack. You close your society, and you close your society by making sure the government protects itself and its citizens. And how do they protect itself? By instituting laws and regulations that include aspects of security to make sure you're not in support of the terrorists, but you're an American, and I can't tell if you are or you aren't. So you start thinking in a different way on how you treat your own citizenry. And it's because you have to protect the citizens. Particularly under terrorism, because you don't know where it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, or who it's going to happen. In the United States, they could identify a specific minority group that are still being identified and still being ostracized, and their relationship with their own government has changed since 9/11. So now we understand even more what the NSA is doing to everybody. If you're an American, you might as well just send them your email and forget the middleman, because they're reading it anyway. So here's the situation where you've got substantial security controls, not because the American government is evil, not because the American government is treating everyone as guilty, but because the American government wants to make sure these terrorist attacks are ended. But with the United States, there's another element. They have an external response. They can go and invade Afghanistan. They can go and invade Iraq, which has nothing to do with it. The Cuban government doesn't have that option. They can't go and invade Florida. Well, they could, but I don't think they can do them too good. So how do they react to the terrorism? How do they react to the siege? They react the same way any government has done, by protecting itself and its citizens. And they get criticized for it. One of the greatest condemnations of Cuba is civil rights restrictions, which are termed human rights restrictions by the United States pro-embargo group, which is ridiculous because human rights means homes, health, jobs, food, and Cuba takes care of those better than most third world countries. Civil rights is, okay, surveillance systems, political plurality, freedom of the press, things like that. Well, Cuba's system is set up differently, and it's harder to address those systems when you are under siege. And there was freedom of the press in the early years of the revolution, but when the press started promoting American invasion, Maria Diario was one of the oldest newspapers in Cuba, and they started actively and openly saying, no, the Americans better come and invade right now to get rid of this government. No government will stand for that, particularly when it's a government that is under threat and under siege from the world's greatest superpower. So all these criticisms are easy to make, but harder to understand unless you put it in context. And so Cuba gets criticized for dissidence. Well, you have to explain what a dissident is. In Cuba, it's an organic society. You can complain, you can recommend, you can help change society. Fact is, Cuba's society economically is changing tremendously from the input of the citizens within the confines of their social economic structure, like any society. Dissidents, however, if they're shown to be in support of America's policy of regime change, and then have been seen to be accepting material or financial aid, that's different. It's the same thing if a group of Americans got together and were found to be receiving financial support from Al-Qaeda and working openly to overthrow the American government, that would not be tolerated in any country. So again, all these concepts of what people will think of negatively are never put in context, are never said, okay, well, here's what the Cubans are reacting. Stop here, and I'll just say it again. The Cuban government, the book, I've talked to so many Cubans who say, yeah, we've made mistakes. We want to improve things. We want to improve things under our system, but we've made a lot of mistakes. But the mistakes can come, not always, but come from the pressure of always being under the microscope of this superpower saying, if you make one mistake, we're going to take advantage of it. So this is what Cuba's been living under since the beginning of the revolution. What's happening now? There are changes on both sides of the Florida Straits. In Cuba, the last few years under Raul, you've seen substantial economic changes. The Cuban government realizes, regardless of the embargo, regardless of the siege, there has to be some structural changes to move Cuba into 21st century socialism. So they're moving that. It's a good thing. There's support for it. Some people are saying it's going too fast, some people are saying it's going too slow. Doesn't matter. The process is happening. It's having an effect on the politics. So all these positive things are creating what in the United States? Nothing. The Obama administration has basically come out and said, well, these reforms are meaningless, which gets back to the American policy of nothing is good enough until this regime is changed. So no matter what the Cubans have done, no matter what the Cubans plan to do, Obama has become another of the American presidents who said, okay, this is the conditions. Cuba has to change this, and then maybe we'll talk about normalization. So the expectation, the hope of Obama has really been lost, because the Cubans have heard this so much before. The Americans said, okay, if Cuba stops international support of revolutionary movements, then we'll talk normalization. That ended, nothing happened. If Cuba gets out of Africa, then we'll talk normalization. That happened, nothing happened. If Cuba eliminates its relationship with the Soviet Union, well, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, then we'll talk. That happened, nothing happened. Now the bugaboo is Cuban human rights relations. So the Americans always move the goalposts, no matter what the Cubans do. Even if they unintentionally meet American standards, it's not good enough. So what's going to change? How is the siege going to end? In my opinion, it will end in the place where it's the strongest, and that's Miami. What you're seeing now politically is a shift in the demographics of the Cuban American community. The first generation exiles who lost the most from the revolution, who developed the siege, who maintained the violence, who are the gatekeepers of siege, they're dying off. What are the new Cuban Americans? They're leaving Cuba for economic reasons, as many immigrants do from third world countries. But they grew up in the revolution. They've seen the revolutionary government at its best, at its worst, but they've understood it. So they're coming to Miami, and they're changing the attitude. And you saw an example of that in 2012. There was the last presidential election. It was quite interesting, and I just need to get the specific names. There was, in Florida, there was a group of hard right Cuban Americans who really supported the embargo. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, David Rivera, Marco Rubio. But there was one, a Republican, David Rivera, who was very hard right, was up against re-election against another Cuban American, Joe Garcia, a Democrat. Now, Joe Garcia, his past was pretty strong, but he's moderated his position somewhat. And in Cuba, in Miami, any moderation of your position against Cuba is a substantial change. Garcia beat Rivera. And I believe part of it was because his position was, more moderate, more pro-engagement. So if this trend continues, if the younger generation of Cuban Americans become politically active, they'll no longer support the hardline right-wingers who are against anything to do with Cuba, including ending the travel for Cuban Americans. So the Cuban American new generation starts voting for Cuban American politicians in South Florida, Miami, who favor engagement, because the new Cuban American generation immigrants the last 20 years want to maintain relations with their family, want to go back and forth to Cuba, want to have the ability to support their family in Cuba, and in fact want normalization of relations. If that happens in 2014, the next election, you'll see a shift in the Congress. The siege, the steering wheel of siege is based in Miami, but the engine is still in Congress. Congress of the United States controls the siege. And they control it by a narrow group of these Cuban Americans who vote voraciously and control the vote whenever a vote comes up. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was a closed vote and to end the travel restrictions. It passed the House of Representatives, but was ended at the Senate because of the influences of these Cuban Americans. So you get Cuban American politicians who favor negotiations, who favor normalization. Then Congress has the opportunity to pass legislation that will end the travel restrictions. And if you end the travel restrictions, you end the embargo. That won't happen if all the hard-right Cuban Americans are still in political power. In the next few years, hopefully that'll change. So the bed of the siege, the supporters of siege are in South Florida, Miami. The resolution of siege may actually come from exactly the same place.